This is an explain question, and the STEM is telling us specifically that we're going to be explaining the difference between the amount of innovation in French painting and the amount of innovation in French sculpture. So we know that about half the time explain questions turn into resolve questions, where instead of there just being one thing to explain, there ends up being a sort of paradox. And one side seems really reasonable, the other side seems kind of strange, and we have to focus our explanation on the strange side. And that's what's happening here. So we're told that during the 19th century, the French Academy of Art was the major financial sponsor of both of these activities, painting and sculpture, and this French Academy discouraged innovation in the arts. And as a consequence, there was very little innovation in sculpture, and all of that makes sense. So these guys were the money, they funded both of these types of projects, and they don't care for innovation. And so that explains why there wasn't very much innovation in sculpture. The weird thing is, there was a lot of innovation in painting. And so how did the painters get away with it? When these guys were the major source of funding and they don't care for innovation, how did we end up with a lot of innovation in painting? And so that's what I'm expecting the answer choice to explain. How did painters innovate if the organization that was the primary source of funding discouraged it? So let's check out the answers. A tells us that the Academy gave more financial support to painting than sculpture, but it doesn't explain why they were allowed to innovate so much. It doesn't really matter that they got more money. I want to hear why they weren't so constrained. Why did sculpture end up being really constrained, and yet the painters were kind of allowed to be creative and innovative? A doesn't give me an answer to that question. B says the Academy supported more sculptors than painters, but painters received more support on average than sculptors. So numerically, we probably, maybe just to put some numbers to this, it's like we had 20 sculptors and only 5 painters, but these guys got more money on average than the sculptors. That still doesn't explain why they were allowed to innovate, though. Why were these guys seemingly allowed to innovate and these guys weren't? This doesn't give me an answer to that, so we're going to keep looking. Because stone is so much more expensive than paint and canvas, far more unsponsored paintings were produced than unsponsored sculptures. And this is the key. If you're unsponsored, then you're not beholden to anybody, right? You don't have to do what the Academy wants you to do because you're not getting any money from them. And so this notion of unsponsored paintings explains how we are going to get innovation in painting. It can't be tied to these guys because these guys don't like innovation. But if nobody's funding you, if you're the source of your own funding or you're unsponsored, you can pretty much do whatever you want. And so that's how answer choice C resolves this paradox and explains why we got more innovation in painting, because the raw materials were so much cheaper, so you could just go it alone. So let's see why D and E are wrong, though. D says very few artists in the 19th century who produced sculptures also produced paintings. So there's not a lot of crossover, but that doesn't explain why the painters were allowed to be innovative. Only C does so far, and that's because they weren't taking the sponsorship money from that conservative group that didn't want them to innovate. And finally, although the Academy was the primary sponsor, the total amount of financial support that was received declined during the 19th century, but that doesn't explain why the painters were seemingly allowed to innovate. Only C does. And it says because they weren't taking money from the group that discouraged innovation. That's why they were allowed to innovate.